Does the world really need another book of criticism exploring Shakespearean plays by way of genre? Obviously, I think it must, because I've written one, focusing on comedy and tragic comedy, which is a much more problematic affair, and doing it by way of an unfamiliar route, by looking at the way in which French intertexts seem to make tragic possibility felt within comic plot mechanisms. From the beginning of Shakespeare's comic career in the 1590s to the last plays that he wrote, and which we call rather uncomfortably tragic comedies or even romances, because we're not sure about the relation between the tragic and the comic elements in those plays. As far as the earlier plays are concerned, it seems to me that what we deal with is the use of French material, evoking intertexts, sometimes by quite specific signals, to evoke the tragic possibilities that could take over a comic plot, but never do, because these are, by definition, comedies. I spend a lot of time doing this with respect to A Midsummer Night's Dream, which seems to me particularly rich in proposing comic patterns that could turn tragic. And I propose three French intertexts that inflect comic love stories in tragic directions, all of them accessible to an Elizabethan audience. I then move on to middle and late comedies, and here I'd single out particularly A Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, and Twelfth Night. Each of them has a particular character that points in a tragic direction. Shylock from Merchant of Venice, Angelo from Measure, and, of course, Malvolio in Twelfth Night. Each of those characters can be attached, I argue, to a French intertext or even intertexts. And the point is that their evocation, then exclusion, which takes various forms, intrudes again on a dominant Italian model. We then arrive finally at the question of tragicomedy, so called, as opposed to tragic elements within or hinted at as being within comic plots. At the very end of his career, Shakespeare produces these plays which seem somehow to fuse comedy and tragedy. Again, it is possible to find Italian novels, but it is also possible to see some of the stories that he's using as mediated by French intertexts. And I end up by talking about the way in which Montaigne, in his essays, calls attention to the fact that tragedy and comedy are really two ways of regarding human experience, which are fused, which come together. And I want to make the case that that way of finally synthesizing the comic and tragic genre owes